Good morning. My name is Deon Rossouw. I'm the CEO of the Ethics Institute, and it gives me great delight to welcome you to this special Ethical Leadership Symposium this morning. The Ethics Institute is an independent institute based in Pretoria, operating out of Pretoria, but we do work across many countries across not only the continent, but the world. This morning is our third Ethical Leadership Symposium. We started this series of symposiums when lockdown prevented us from having a face-to-face conference 3 years ago. And we were delighted to receive more than 1,000 registrations for this event from more than 30 countries on the last count. The duration of the symposium is 90 minutes, so we welcome you for the next 90 minutes and trust that you will be able to stay for the duration of the event. In the latter part of our symposium, you can start posing questions to our panelists. We have a panel of 2 people who will join us, and they will be facilitated by a very able facilitator. Now, the theme of the conference is ethical leadership in state-owned entities, with the very important subtitle, "It is not too late." And we are very privileged that we have the Minister responsible for public enterprises in South Africa, the Honourable Minister Pravin Gordhan, with us this morning. He will do the opening. After that, we will have the CEO of Siemens South Africa, Ms. Sabine Dall'Omo, who will set the theme of ethical leadership in state-owned entities. It's not too late, and she will speak from a public sector perspective. And then we go over to our panel discussion, which will be facilitated by Mr. Chris Maroleng, who also has experience of working in a state-owned entity, Dr. Reuel Khoza, who chaired more than one state-owned entity with distinction, I must add, and then also Mr. Patrick Dlamini, who is the current CEO of the Development Bank of South Africa. And then shortly before 10:30, we will do the closing. Well, going back to the theme of our conference, ethical leadership in state-owned enterprises, we all know that state-owned enterprises are quite crucial for providing much needed infrastructure and also much needed services. But specifically here in South Africa, our state-owned entities, and especially the bigger, more prominent ones, went through quite a rough period of where there was rampant corruption in these state-owned entities. And at the moment, there is a very deliberate and very concerted effort to do something about this, to get them back on the path of ethical integrity, but of course of effective service delivery. And we all know that when it comes to good leadership, there are 2 things that are always so prominent and so cardinal, and those are ethics and competence. The King Report on Corporate Governance in South Africa reminds us that corporate governance is really about ethical and effective leadership. And in a recent survey conducted by the Edelman's Trust Barometer, they found also the same, that the 2 things that really matter when it comes to whether your stakeholders trust you are your ethics and your competence. But then they also found that the thing that matters most in order to gain the trust of your stakeholders is the ethics of your organization. So therefore, we are quite honored to welcome here this morning the Honourable Minister for Public Enterprises in South Africa, Minister Pravin Gordhan. And he is the current Minister of Public Enterprises and has occupied this position since the 27th of February in 2018. With that, Mr. Gordhan, I invite you to do a short opening statement for our event.
Good morning to you, Prof. Good morning to my fellow panelists and our colleague from Siemens as well, and all those that have joined this morning. The question of ethical leadership in SOEs is a critical one. And I can assure you it is definitely not too late to talk about ethical leadership, but also to start introducing ethical leadership in what we have to do in order to restore our democratic values, but more importantly, restore faith in the SOEs and their functionality as well. Clearly, from our point of view as government, but even as the people of South Africa, we've always had this aspiration and vision that state-owned enterprises in one form or another have a critical role to play in the future development post-1994 of our society, our economy, of infrastructure, and above all, for a better life for all South Africans. And it is in that sense that this aspiration was, if you like, corrupted by the cancer of state capture in recent years. And regrettably, what we've had and the kind of damage that has been caused to SOEs is not appreciated adequately. But I can assure you that from the inside, SOEs have been systemically damaged. The damage is deep, both in an institutional sense, but also in an operational, financial, and culture sense. And participants in this damage weren't just political figures, but also important players, both South African and overseas, from the business sector as well, which includes entities like auditors and so on, who looked the other way for too long. But we're in a different era now. We're in an era where the president and many, many South Africans want to see the state-owned enterprises play their rightful role and contribute to every aspect of development, as I said. But above all, ensure that the beneficiaries of that development are the people of South Africa and just not a small group that belong to the elite, both black and white. There are many South Africans who are also dismissive of the findings of Chief Justice Zondo and the commission that he has been chairing. And that kind of denialism does not help either, because I think it's quite important for us to recognize the findings of the Zondo Commission, the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, but also the actions that need to be pursued as a result. State capture was the result of a combination of, let's call it bad politics, of sheer human greed, and the exploitation of procurement practices and systems and financial systems, as you will see when more and more people appear in the courts and the charge sheets that they will have presented to them. The areas that were effectively damaged in this process. But perhaps a lesson for all of us is that when we talk about governance of SOEs and reform of SOEs, we need to distinguish, certainly from an Ethics Institute point of view, but even wider than that, the distinction between formalism and substance. You can have a board, as many companies do, and many entities do, but the board can be purely a ritualistic exercise. Or you can have a board that truly cares, that understands the national mission, but above all has the courage of its conviction to intervene when wrong things are actually happening, notwithstanding the consequences for them as well. The same applies to management. You can be technically competent, but the question is, what ethics drives you? What does your integrity say to you? When will you take a stand against malfeasance of one kind or another? And what are you willing to sacrifice as a consequence? Business, and as I said, certain professionals have been very quiet in this process. Very few have come forward to say, I have collaborated with the process of state capture. And it is time that we acknowledge that our business and professional practices also need to undergo a profound change if we are to truly overcome the kind of legacy that we've actually had. So, Prof, as a consequence, the human factor plays a very important role. And by that I mean, do we have individuals with the right kind of ethical leadership? Do we have human beings in boards and managements and in society out there who have the courage of their convictions to actually take a stand, so to speak, and say this far and no further? And that is the question that we are facing today as well. There are many forces that want to and are actually propagating fake news of one kind or another. There are many who are fighting in order to stay out of jail and orange uniforms. There are many who will continue to undermine the process of rebuilding our democracy, its institutions, and the faith of our people in our democracy and in our constitution as well. Beware these people, because this is the beginning of a process which could end up in a serious level of impunity in South Africa that in years to come we might all actually regret. My last 2 points. The first is, that being so, what are we going to do about it? And Quo Vadis, South Africa. So we need to certainly give a lot more energy and conviction to the processes of reforms, both as a result of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, but also as lessons that we have learned during this last few years as well, as we try to dismantle the impact of state capture and the kind of machinery that state capture actually put in place. So we've got to rethink how boards are chosen, who is actually put onto a board, and the kind of mission for the next couple of years that members of governing boards would have as participants in the process of reform in every sense of the word. And by that I mean reforming the governance within the institution, the operations of the institution, the work ethic within an institution, repositioning the finances of the institution, often in the current environment, creating new business models that will enable SOEs to be successful, and build the right kind of, and a new kind of relationship between the public and the private sector. And it is quite critical, and in that sense, this webinar and symposium is quite important, as to ask ourselves the question, what are the ethics and principles that will guide us as we go forward? So as we traverse the next few months and possibly the next few years, I think South Africans want to see the results of the findings of the Zondo Commission reflected in prosecutions, successful ones, and the guilty parties being dealt with in the right way in accordance with the law, but certainly ensuring that all of us prevent a culture of impunity from settling in. So finally, let us work with hope, let us work with courage, let us demonstrate the kind of resilience that's required in any rebuilding process. And in doing that, we need to all work against this impunity factor and the undermining of our democracy and these institutions. And a special kind of principled activism is going to be required of all of us if we're going to succeed. Let me wish you well for the rest of the webinar. And if you don't mind, I have to get back to my meeting. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. We really appreciate that you made time, and we are well aware that you have other commitments. But thank you for setting such a positive tone and to remind us that we need both ethics and competence, but also an ecosystem where also business, public sector, and our professions also play their role. I think that is the right tone to start on. Thank you very much. We appreciate your presence here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ms. Sabine Dall'Omo is the CEO of Siemens South Africa, but she also serves as the Deputy Chairperson of the NEPAT Business Foundation and as a member of the Presidential Advisory Council on Investment. Sabine, thank you for joining us once more. If you can unmute and come on camera, that would be great. And while you do so, we also would like to thank once again Siemens, who is the sponsor of our event for the third year running. Thank you, Sabine, and there you are. Please tell us why, from a public sector perspective, it is so important that we have state-owned enterprises with integrity and competence that can deliver.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, I think the minister sets a quite decisive tone on what's going to come also in South Africa. But when we look at corruption per se, and I'm very honored Siemens to be able to sponsor this year again this event. When we look at corruption, we maybe have to look at what does it actually mean. It refers to the abuse of public and private office for personal gain. And this includes active and passive misuse of powers within the public office. And the minister already alluded to it, specifically what we have seen in some of the state-owned entities. When we also look at state-owned enterprises per se, and Professor Rossouw, you mentioned that as well, they are the main conduit of the state to exercise the duty in order to provide service, not only to business, but also to private people. The benefit of state-owned entities is the economic benefit for each country. And so costs of misuse, they are also as the account for everybody. And that's why it's important as well that matters like they are highlighted in the Zondo Commission are taken up and taken serious to be implemented, and recommendations are taken in order to reform also the sector. Well, state-owned entities globally are accounting for 22% of the largest companies, and therefore they have a significant impact not only on each country's GDP, but also on the global GDP. And what we see within state-owned entities, and that's maybe also one reason to why we see abuse and in not only South Africa, but also globally, is that their boundaries are often also going beyond the state. Like if we think about Transnet, Eskom here in South Africa, they are active in countries beyond South Africa. And they're often active in concentrated sectors with strategic importance, like for instance, transport, energy, oil and gas, and the likes. And therefore, the state and society are increasingly exposed to potential misuse within these areas. But as Professor Rossouw said, not everything is gloom and doom. So we do see that there are breakdowns in the system, and the Zondo report has highlighted it. And corruption in state-owned entities is seen, as mentioned, beyond South Africa, maybe not to that extent. But it always comes back that there is a lack of mechanism in order to curb corruption or abuse of power. This includes corruption-specific controls and risk management within these entities, a thorough risk management process, but also proper internal and external audit work. And what is more important, reporting mechanism, whistleblowing, which is protected, but also code of conduct specifically with regards to ethics. And the evidence shows that if you have these in place and you follow through, specifically if you have leaders which have the right ethical intention to manage a business, then things can change. What are the most 10 most biggest obstacles in state-owned entities, which hinder us currently to see exactly transformation into a non-corrupt or in an ethical leadership. One is definitely, and this is number one, is a lack of a culture to integrity in political, but also in the public sector. It's a lack of awareness amongst employees of the need or priority placed on them for integrity. Often you have opportunistic behavior. I think that's all the time and everywhere. A lack of awareness with regards to the legal requirements which need to be adhered to. But also there is a perceived situation that people think they might not be caught, and it's the risk of it is very low. Often, and we see this in our situation, particular with the state-owned entities in South Africa, is an overly complex and burdensome legal requirements in order to adhere to public tender processes, but also inadequate financial and human resources in order to invest into integrity and prevention of corruption. As I mentioned, ineffective internal controls, but also missing channels for whistleblowers to move forward. So how does this now link back to Siemens? At Siemens, we have our collective action efforts, which we implement over a variety of industries and players within the countries where we are active in. This is really meant to build and work together for an ethical environment in business, in the private and in the public environment. The Ethics Institute is a strong partner for us in order to implement that. And today, the webinar should help you to get more insights on how ethical leadership can look like in state-owned entities, but also in the private sector. The need for ethical leadership is more important than ever, because with all the things happening currently globally, we need to, as leaders of companies, assure to our employees, but also to society, that we deal with our resources in the most ethical manner. In Siemens, we have made ethics part of our strategic application. We have communicated last year in our Capital Market Day that within our degree framework, ethical is one of the most important components. And therefore, our business conduct guidelines, which guide our employees, but also for sure our managers, and set our framework with regards to whistleblowing, monitoring, control, but also risk management, are the fundament for the action Siemens is taken in our business, which we are conducting in South Africa and around the globe. For me, it is great to host the seminar as a sponsor of Siemens, and I give back to Professor Rossouw, and thank you so much. Have a nice morning.
Thank you, Ms. Dall'Omo, for setting that scene for us, reminding us just how crucial our state-owned enterprises are for not only the country, but also the region. And also for emphasizing that we need, once again, as the Honorable Minister also said, a whole ethical ecosystem for organizations to deliver on their purpose, and specifically for state-owned enterprises to do so. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the facilitator of our panel discussion this morning, who is Mr. Chris Maroleng. Now, Chris is a global advisor and also the SADC Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. He is an accomplished public and corporate affairs practitioner with close to 20 years of working experience specializing in strategy, research, media, communication, security, corporate governance, and public affairs. And I am especially grateful to Chris for joining us just after 3 in the morning in Atlanta in the USA, where he's currently on a visit. Chris, thanks for honoring your commitment to us. And I now hand over to you to introduce our 2 panelists. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Prof. And greetings to everyone watching this webinar all the way from Atlanta in Georgia in the United States, where I am undertaking a few consultations here. Maybe perhaps, Prof, before I actually introduce our panelists, let me just begin with a brief introduction of our subject today, and also to contextualize why Good Governance Africa, the organization that I work with, has chosen to partner with the Ethics Institute to carry out this very crucial and I think timely deep dive into the state of ethics in some of our public or rather our state-owned enterprises. Let me start off with Good Governance Africa. We are an applied policy research think tank and advocacy organization that has offices in Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, and our headquarters is actually here in South Africa. We were founded in 2012, and GGA works to advance governance across the African continent through research, advocacy, and really strategically partnering with both public and private sector stakeholders. In this regard, I'd also like to thank again the Institute for this invitation to participate in today's event, which is titled Ethical Leadership in State-Owned Enterprises. It is not too late. And also acknowledge the excellent work that has been done by Prof. Deon, who is the CEO of the Institute, and his team in this field of ethics, which we'll be looking at today, and in particular, the question of leadership. Let me, at the same time, acknowledge the remarks that we received from Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Pravin Gordhan, and also for the scene setting that was so well set out by the CEO of Siemens, Ms. Sabine Dall'Omo, and really for creating a solid platform for us to engage in this facilitated engagement. So with regards to the facilitation, I've been asked really to provide an opportunity for us to have a distinguished panel of interlocutors with me today to really unpack what is going on in some of our SOEs. Why do some of them seem to succeed and many others seemingly seem to falter and become a burden to the state, which they're supposed to deliver these very important services? So in this regard, let me start off by introducing our first panelist. And we have Dr. Reuel Khoza. Dr. Reuel Khoza, who is known to all of us, is currently chairman at Dana Investment Pty Ltd. He's also been, or is currently, the chairman of the Public Investment Corporation, the PIC, ASUPOL. He has chaired boards in illustrious corporations such as Nedbank Group. He's also been the chair at an SOE, ESCOM, which for many people really seems to highlight what happens when SOEs fail in their mandate. He has served as director of JSC Limited, IBM South Africa, and many other corporates. So we're very grateful to have him here today. We also have Mr. Patrick Dlamini, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of the DBSA since 2012. Prior to his appointment, he served as the CEO of the Air Traffic and Navigation Service Company of South Africa. He's also worked for South African Airways and as the Executive Vice President and General Manager responsible for cargo at Transnet Limited business unit. So as you can see, we've selected these distinguished interlocutors because they would provide us with the basis to basically begin understanding how leadership impacts on ethics, and more importantly, how ethics impacts on the state of leadership and the well-being of the members of these SOEs who are tasked to work and deliver this service. So in this regard, to contextualize it even further before I bring in our two panelists to speak, we at Good Governance Africa say that governance is important, and it's important because we have a very simple definition of what governance means. we say it's about who gets what, when, and how. It's really about the authoritative allocation of resources. And I think what's important for this conversation that we're having today is that we are looking at how this question of who gets what, when, and how is affected by the quality of leadership and the ethics of those leaders, in particular in SOEs. In essence, we also believe that in this process of the authoritative allocation of resources, that good governance should be built on an effective state, a mobilized civil society, and an efficient private and public sector. These key elements of good governance that really make this become entrenched and work are the state of, or the quality of accountability, transparency, and our ability to combat malfeasance and corruption within these SOEs that we're focusing today. What's also important is whether we have an enabling legal and judicial framework. Minister Pravin Gordhan began to refer to the great work that was carried out and sometimes very underrated work that was carried out by the Zondo Commission. So while we believe that African states should be free to choose the type of governance systems best suited to their individual needs and context, we argue that it becomes clear that these elements that I mentioned before, mobilized civil society, an effective private and public sector, that transparency and accountability will really determine the quality of the performance of some of these SOEs. And more importantly, the ethical standards of the leaders who find themselves in these organizations. With that short introduction, let me provide a platform for Dr. Khoza, maybe in about 5 minutes, to give us your introductory thoughts into this very important question around ethics and leadership in SOEs. Over to you, Dr. Khoza.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir, you can.
No, thank you very much, Chris, for the very fine introduction, deservedly to a degree, perhaps a little bit hyperbolic. I thank you very much for putting me on the platform. May I start off by thanking you and thanking the speakers who spoke before me. The minister, I think, spoke with such concern and has done a great deal of analysis as to what is actually going wrong with our state-owned enterprises and the need to actually take corrective action and introduce ethical leadership. Professor Rossouw, I think, did a superb job of actually outlining what ethical behavior, to what extent ethical behavior actually contribute to the appropriate running of organizations, and pairing that with competence. Perhaps I should start off by elaborating a little bit on what makes for ethical leadership in organizations, may they be in the private sector or the public sector. In addition to the two pillars that Professor Rossouw referred to, you might like to add integrity, which is acting with honesty in carrying out your leadership responsibilities. You may also like to add a sense of responsibility, very, very important. But also there has to be accountability. In his parting shot, the minister mentioned something about consequence management, that people actually do dastardly things and they know they can actually get away with it. They are not going to land in jail when in fact that's where they belong. They may not end up wearing orange overalls, which is in fact what should actually befit them. consequence management or the lack of it, where state-owned enterprises are concerned, even where some private sector organizations are concerned, has been, in fact, one of our greatest undoings. So add a sense of responsibility, add accountability, and to that also add transparency. State-owned enterprises in recent years have tended to be run in a manner that is very, very opaque, that is not transparent, which is in fact a pain. We should not allow that at all. But it has been actually the bane of our existence in recent times. And add to that the need to be fair. There has been no fairness in a number of respects, starting with recruitment. We have suffered the plague of deployment, where people get to be put into responsible positions without due process in ensuring that they actually stack up against criteria, which is in fact against set criteria for actually doing the job. Deployment has been a cause of a substantial measure of the rot that state-owned enterprises have been suffering over the years. Now, what could one suggest be the prelude to ethical leadership in state-owned enterprises? The question there, underlying question is, it is not too late, or is it too late? I think the answer is the underlying message there. It is not too late. It cannot be too late. It dare not be too late. Time is always right to do right. Time is always good to do good. And as Ms. Sabine Dall'Omo actually pointed out, state-owned enterprises are a phenomenon that is universal. She indicated that on average, about 22% of all organizations and enterprises in the world are actually owned by the state. The important thing is, are they run effectively? Are they run ethically? Now, where do we start where South African SOEs are concerned? I want to believe that we must start with a thorough analysis. The minister has done a great deal of giving the background where that is concerned. But I think we need to go a little bit more granular and drill a lot deeper. A legend has it that we have several hundred state-owned enterprises. They're just too many. Now, you got to do the analysis that enables you to classify them. There are those that are, purely unnecessary. I think you can actually conclude that. That's the first class in that the first category in that classification. They don't deserve to exist. And I believe the state must render them non-existent. Do away with them professionally and in a manner that befits their being done away with. They are essentially, lies in the body of the state. When I say lies, I'm talking about lies spelled L-I-C-E as the plural of louse. They are just as, squatting as parasites on the body, and they've got to be getting rid of. And then there are those that are medium-sized and are very much marginal or poorly run, when in fact they could be very, very effectively run. Take as an example, Alexco. One might say perhaps the state has no business running a diamond mining operation. But if it chooses to, it must run it properly. And we do have an example not very far from where we are in Botswana, Botswana thrives on tourism and the diamond industry. And the diamond industry is a partnership between the state and the private sector. Why not do the same thing with the likes of Alexco? And then there are the essential ones. Transnet, in particular, the rail system. It is so essential for the industry and the economy of South Africa to really function. There's a lot that has got to be transported, long range, where the use of the road is purely ineffective and inefficient. But what needs to be done about those, like Transnet and the rail system in particular, and Eskom, is to take decisive action. You cannot be limp-wristed in actually dealing with those because they are so crucial for the success of our political economy. You need to do the kind of diagnosis that actually enables you to do the corrective action that is essential. Make sure that the work ethic, which has been sorely lacking in some of the state-owned enterprises, including the major ones that I've just referred to. Make sure that having addressed the phenomenon of the fish rotting from the head, because that's when, in fact, the inefficiency, the unethical conduct crept in, the fish that started rotting from the head with the ownership, i.e., state leadership being rotten and then cascading right down to the board, right down to the senior executives, management, and the entire organization. So I think we need to do something about addressing that. Without that, I think unethical leadership will continue to battle to find its way into state-owned enterprises. Right. Perhaps I should conclude by saying that the approach should be serious, it should be earnest, it should be genuine. And perhaps there is a need for the state to seriously consider private-public partnerships and see big business not as a foe, but as a potential partner who could actually bring pressure to bear to do corrective action and to introduce ethical leadership. There are examples the world over, particularly the likes of Japan between the two world wars, of state and the private sector working together to good effect to run organizations effectively, efficiently, and ethically. Perhaps I should just stop there, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Khoza. Maybe before we move to bring in Mr. Dlamini into the debate, Dr. Khoza, just need to ask something for you which struck me. You mentioned the problem with the process around political interference by the shareholder representative being government, and maybe a deployment occurring from the governing party, and that this led to certain instances of maybe ineffective people being appointed to lead these organizations, and those lacking ethical qualities that would take to turn around these organizations. It seems to me that you seem to be putting across the view that is deployment something that is specific to South Africa? It does appear that political parties elsewhere also appoint their leaders or preferred leaders into these positions. What is unique about South Africa?
I guess what is unique about South Africa is, in my observation, the inability or unwillingness to deploy. If you want to deploy, you must first actually make sure that there are certain criteria that need to be met. You don't deploy based on who was very, very effective in supporting you, to ascend to the political leadership that there is, you actually deploy with a view to making sure that the state-owned enterprises operate as enterprises. And enterprises appoint people based on criteria that actually insist on expertise, on the requisite qualifications, on the requisite experience. You must also insist, as a matter of ethical conduct, on people who are wholesome in terms of their approach to doing what it is they do, and who actually enter the arena of delivering in terms of ethical leadership with a background that bespeaks ethical behavior, a background that actually bespeaks not being careless, not being corrupt, not being evil, not being ineffective. All of those have got to come to the fore in your selection. Nobody says that a government or a ruling party should have no say. They must have a say, but with guidelines that are ethical, with guidelines that seek to optimize that which has got to be done. If you want to appoint somebody to the board, they must actually have the requisite background. The board that we have in one of the state-owned enterprises lately, I don't want to mention names, does not have the requisite, people don't have the requisite qualifications, not the requisite experience, not the germane or relevant skills that the board actually requires. And lately, the board is under-resourced, where it should be having something like 15 or 16 members. It currently has 6. You cannot, from that, have the required committees that should actually do the nitty-gritty work.
Sorry, I have to cut you off here, Dr. Khoza. Fantastic response. And I think it's a good segue into bringing in Mr. Patrick Dlamini, a person I consider to be one of those wholesome leaders in state-owned entities. Mr. Dlamini, maybe in 5 minutes, sir, your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Maroleng. Greetings to my big brother, Mr. Khoza, and greetings to Prof. Rossouw and the entire team of Ethics Institute, and really greetings to the Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Gordhan, in his absence, and greetings to the fellow panelists and everyone on this platform. This is I think it's opportune that we get to engage on this, because it is something that is extremely important for the country, extremely important for the future, and for our economy as well. I fully agree that it is never too late. I am one of those who are eternal optimists, but it's all about how quickly do we act and how swiftly do we move to make sure that we get things back in order. But again, there is compliance and then there's ethics. These two are not the same, yet they are related. Because I always say to people, compliance is about complying with the rule of law and regulations in place. And ethics is like gold standards of compliance, and it's much more higher, and it is an embodiment of values as well. So when we get to decide on the leadership of organizations, we have to make sure that the environment is created for people of integrity, for people actually who have respect both for self and others, and for people who have beliefs in equity and justice systems. And also these are people who are supposed to also subscribe to the values of courage. And integrity is extremely central, because when you have people that actually are ethical, you then have people that will always know that they are there to serve. Because you're talking about servant leadership when you talk about these people. But yes, I fully agree that it's all about the function of leadership. But again, it's also the function of environment, what we're seeing happening in our sister SOEs, and which is our environment as DBSA across the country, is very much also the paucity of the enforcement of the rule of law. Because when you have a total collapse in the enforcement of the rule of law, then people are going to have to take chances. We have seen this going actually right across the spheres of our government in our country, and now you're seeing people being killed. But again, this is also where the interrelationship of both public and private happens. Because if you look at the malfeasance in the public sector, it is with the private sector mostly, depending how you describe the private sector, because those are private individuals and private companies that are involved and also try doing this in collusion with the public sector. But again, for me, it's also, I think courage comes to the center as the leader of an institution, because politics in South Africa has deteriorated, whether we like it or not. And when you have that, there is absolutely nothing wrong with deployment, as long as deployment is done with competence, integrity, and quality in mind. Because then those people go there and they make sure that they have what it takes to execute their jobs. But then the environment gets created, because then politicians then appoint boards. And these boards are not actually done in line with the due governance that will make sure that they are fit for purpose. Because again, therein lies the weakness in the system. Because when you appoint boards, you have to make sure that these people are fit for purpose. They have what it takes in terms of qualification. They have what it takes in terms of experience and background. They have what it takes in terms of characters. And they have what it takes to make sure that they are there to serve the people of South Africa. When you have politicians putting in their friends and putting in their relatives, because there's a lot of facade. Some politicians will come across as being strict. Meanwhile, these are the same politicians who then actually push their own personal friends without actually the due process. So I think the truth will have to be told. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are, where we're seeing our economy collapsing to the extent that it has. We wouldn't be where we are, where we see that load shedding has become the norm in South Africa and has seriously sabotaged job creation in our country, because we are not decisive enough and we don't understand how this is robbing our people the jobs that could be created if we were really working towards the security of energy. It's at the center of this thing. And when you have that, then you would start to have people that now all of a sudden are unemployed and then start actually to say, how do I survive? Yep. And when you have, and then you have deterioration and the rule of law does not work. And it becomes a massive challenge when the environment has rotten to that extent. We will have to dig deep to get our country where it's supposed to be and on the trajectory where it's supposed to go to. But again, when then as a leader of the institution, you know what is right and you know what is wrong. No one will make you do what actually you know clearly that actually does not align with your own personal values.
Mr. Dlamini, thank you so much for those opening remarks. I want to follow up with a question, and it leads on from what was shared by Minister Gordhan. He said that we must be able to differentiate between formalism and substance. And you took it forward also, and you said, ethics is the embodiment of values. I'll take it even further and say that it is at a cultural level, an organizational cultural level, that we must ensure that these ethics are embodied, as you seem to suggest here. How have you done that? And what do you think has been the failure in other SOEs to create a culture that is framed in good and sound ethics?
I think it's all about your true north value system as a leader. For me, it is important that courage becomes one of those true north values, where you do not look away, nor bury your head into the sand, hoping that the problems are going to blow over. It's also about how do you look at your own leadership, vis-a-vis the vision where you want to take the organization to. And then how do you get to influence the day-to-day behaviors of both leadership and the organization as a whole, and the zero tolerance for unethical behavior and incompetence as well. Yep. It's not easy. That's why I say courage becomes important. Yes. It is not to say that we didn't have to deal with issues of being approached or issues where we had to headbutt with sometimes our political principles. These are never-ending battles that as a leader you must prepare yourself to, that you are going to keep on actually embarking on. And people come to respect you over time because they know exactly where you stand. I will not go and because I'm in front of a politician and agree to things that I clearly know are not in line with our values and as an institution. I have to, at the end of the day, have to put my hand into my heart and look at my family in the face and tell them if actually what I'm doing, they will be proud of. It's extremely important because when these things don't talk to your personal values, then you are bound to misstep and do things actually that will keep you awake at night.
Thank you, Mr. Dlamini. We are monitoring your questions and answers that are appearing in the chat. And one of the questions that's been brought out, and here let me bring back Dr. Khoza, if you don't mind, monitoring our chat, is a direct question to you, Mr. Khoza, which is, did you see any red flags appearing at Eskom with regards to malfeasance during your period as chair? And if you did, what did you do about them? Were these really driven, some of these red flags that are referred to from questions around a failure of internal audit and other questions like this? Dr. Khoza?
No, thank you very much for that question. Foreseeing things is supposed to be one of the key qualifications of any leader. The leader has got to look ahead in doing whatever it is he's doing by way of leading. Where Eskom was concerned, not only did one anticipate that things might actually perhaps deteriorate from the apex that we left the organization at. One, as early as 1998, which was only 2-3 years into my chairmanship and part of the leadership, we actually submitted a white paper that did a very, very thorough analysis and a projection of what needed to be done. 98 pages. And we submitted that to government. We suggested that in order for us to be still functionally optimal by 2006, we should actually start building. We should actually start doing away with some of the mothballed operations. And government had other plans. They wanted to open up Eskom for competition ostensibly. And knowing full well that at the time it was going to be very difficult for anybody to enter the fray in South Africa because Eskom was so efficiently run and nobody in fact was forthcoming. So that was the one thing. The other thing was I actually argued and pleaded, as it were, with the ownership of Eskom, in other words, the shareholder, that I should be succeeded by somebody who was a business person And there is somebody that I recommended at the time who was, in certain respects, even sort of better than me in my chairmanship. A business person, highly respected, a chartered accountant, a trailblazer in business. And government opted to have me succeeded by a political appointee who was an able leader politically, but had never been in business. And ESCOM had to be run as a business enterprise, chaired by somebody with the requisite business expertise and qualifications, resourced at best at the where the board is concerned by a board that was balanced with the requisite skills, and run by an executive that was very, very professional. Things began to deteriorate when what I had lamented at the beginning, deployment, gained ascendancy over meritocracy. And you then began to see mediocrity being elevated to the status of virtue.
Mm-hmm. So then, Mr. Dlamini, a lot of questions are coming in around the fact that you've received, even this year, a clean audit. Question of, for you, what's the difference between pure compliance and ethical conduct that leads to the kind of audit outcomes that you have recently received, positive audit outcomes?
Thank you, Chris. I think these things, they happen. It's amazing actually how what is supposed to be a given has become an achievement. But this actually, they really have a bedrock of professionalism and competence. When you have people actually that are professional and that are competent and they know what they are doing and they are held accountable to those standards of performance, people are going to give you that performance. It's all about how do we create that environment from the board across the organization. But again, I must say that we've also been lucky to have ministers of finance that have been quite supportive and working much more closer with us. And I must say we had part quite greatly also with our colleagues in National Treasury, but it's all for the greater good. Because where we differ, we do not shy away from differing with them when we feel that actually we have another view, not because we want to be belligerent as an SOE. We understand we're a policy instrument of the state, but we know what we want to do, what we believe is in the best interest. But not that actually they want to compromise, but it's just that sometimes it's the what and the how and how we also look at it. But you must always be happy to engage and differ without actually being disagreeable with your colleagues across the system of government. But really for us, it's been also, I think I must say that it's been the privilege because we have always cultivated an environment where people take pride being associated with the bank. And as a result, they really look forward to coming to work. And their families are proud for what actually the bank is doing. Because sometimes I know in certain instances where people did not even want to disclose who they work for because of the issues that actually were being heard about in that institution. So I think it's all about having professionals who are qualified and competent and take pride in what they do.
Fantastic. Some affirmation coming in here from Zakaria Hussein, who is monitoring the panel discussion. He says, there are not enough sessions like this. We need to reignite these discussions to negate the negativity and, more importantly, to infuse good governance and ethics in the consciousness and hearts of the people that will be needed to turn the tide. And that brings me to you, Dr. Khoza. It's all about the people. You talk about ethics from a concept of Ubuntu. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. And ultimately, one of the questions from a leadership perspective is, what is it from an ethical perspective do you engage in that really creates the safety in organizations and the culture in organizations for ethics to be the number one determinant, and really allowing people even to whistleblow and to lay complaints when they see bad ethical practices?
No, thank you very much once again, Chris. I think the key to all of that is a wholesome culture that you actually referred to in introducing your particular organization. How do you actually inculcate that? I think it starts from the top. For one thing, if you are given a major corporation to chair or to head as a chief executive, you yourself must have a wholesome sense of destiny. You should not just go in there because you have some expertise and you can deliver and earn a salary. You must go there with a sense of purpose that says you are here to make a positive difference. But a personal sense of destiny and personal articulated vision is not enough. You must get your senior team to actually align with you. And you cannot impose your personal vision. You got to cultivate it jointly with your senior executives. And once you have actually achieved alignment, in a sense, that essentially says show respect. You mentioned Ubuntu. It is critical at the philosophical level. You cannot be Cartesian, in other words, follow the ethics of René Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. Whatever he imagines in the lonely citadels of his self makes him what he is. It cannot be. We are an interdependent species. Umuntu ngumuntu ungabantu. Interdependence is a much higher value to independence, so-called independence. You can't deal with complexity as an individual. There are many, many things you're not going to be able to see. All of us have our blind spots. And unfortunately for some of us, the blind spots are even larger than the portion of the eye that sees. So there is a sense in which you have to get alignment. So the culture of aligning senior leadership, starting with the board, the C-suite members, and then cascading down is very, very important, because dealing with complexity behoves us to have all hands on deck.
So in that regard, and Mr. Dlamini, it really feeds in nicely to what has been pointed out here by Dr. Khoza. S. Matthews says, maybe it's time for us to be more radical in imposing the kind of ethical and functional requirements for high performance culture in SOEs. And he says, it's probably time for an entirely independent governance officer who functions in real time, not as part of a periodic audit, but a monitoring officer reporting to cabinet, the minister, parliament, etc. Such officers should oversee and report on ethical and professional standards, probity of transactions, tender assessments, etc. It's a good point. Is it time to be radical in our reform processes of SOEs, especially around ethics and governance, especially considering the fact that we're actually asking, are we out of time here?
I think, Chris, it's time to be radical about everything as a country. Because if you ask me, so many things are going wrong. So we have to make sure that we nip this thing in the bud.
Yeah.
And we have to make sure that we do what is right, because we owe it to ourselves and to the future of this country. So we should not be apologetic about doing what is right. And it's about time that we fix this before actually things get well. I think if you ask me, a lot has gone wrong. but we have then to fix. But at the same time, who are the players? The various levers have got to be radical without exception. Because when we do not do that, we then will continue to whittle away as a country. We will continue to have a youth unemployment of 70%. We will continue to have a broad definition of unemployment of nearly 50% of population. Because then that says we have people that are living with indignity, people that are living with poverty, and with the high levels of income inequality that we have as a country. There is no more right time for us to be radical, to try and get it, because we are on a ticking time bomb. For our own sake and for the sake of the future of our country, we really have then to go radical and do what is right, and also make sure that the rule of law is enforced to the strictest level.
Yeah, and you know, it really blends in very nicely to a fantastic piece that was written by Lulama Kabaka of the Ethics Institute, who basically uses a methodology of differential analysis on SEOs, and he finds a few things that need to be in place. And I'll just recite some of them here because they really contextualize some of the key building blocks towards building ethical leadership in SOEs. He says ethics, accountability, and responsibility are crucial. They must be in place. And here, I think he begins to point out the difference between being responsible and being accountable, especially from a performance perspective. He talks about employee commitments to ethics. How do you create that culture within an organization that enables and facilitates the establishment of these employee commitments? Senior management and middle management commitment also is crucial, because it's often pointed out that where there are junior employees, they tend to look up to their seniors for guidance on how to engage in ethical practices. He says one of the ways we can do this is create an environment where you have town halls, or what he describes as ethical talks, to basically say that it's okay for us to talk about ethics. It's okay for us to create an open, accountable, and transparent environment where ethics ultimately drive and lead us to a high performance culture. He says ethical treatment of people. This is something that, Dr. Khoza referred to earlier on, where he says you need to treat people with Ubuntu, with pure respect and dignity in the organization. This big man boss syndrome probably needs to come to an end. And these observations, Dr. Khoza, really set a great tone for us to begin our concluding remarks on what it is that you want to leave us with as we wrap up our discussion around this issue of ethics. Over to you, Dr. Khoza.
Chris, thank you very much. I think the article by Lulama comes in very, very handy. It's clear that he has actually done some analysis and collated the kinds of things that need to be done. Ethical behavior, ethical conduct should not be seen as secondary, because without it, in fact, organizations collapse. Organizations that don't care either for their employees or even for the environment. We have seen a number of corporations actually collapse by dint of not being able, being competent, but because they did not have ethics at the core of the organization. They flouted ethical requirements, including flouting ethical requirements relating to the environment. There are a number of oil companies that were brought to some halt or standstill or even death. If you take Enron, for instance, what made it die was lack of ethics, lack of morality, not lack of skill. The skill was clearly there in abundance. So there is a sense in which the two pillars that Professor Rossouw referred to earlier on, competence and ethics or ethical conduct, have actually have to stand side by side in a manner that says you don't ignore the one to the exclusion of the, to the exclusion of the other. You actually have to emphasize both of them in inductions, in training sessions, in the town halls that Lulama has actually referred to. At ESCOM, when I was there was a so-called top 30. We made sure that the culture of caring, the culture of sharing, the culture of understanding that you cannot figure it out alone. You got to work together. All of that was inculcated, and that cascaded to the so-called top 300. Then from the top 300, that was made to cascade right down across the organization. That not only have you got to be skilled, you got to ensure morality and ethical behavior throughout. So that I would like to believe organizations have got to find ways of adhering to. It is not enough to be competent purely. It is not enough to be ethical purely. You got to have the two in absolute perfect tango.
Excellent. As usual, wonderful and insightful comments from you, Dr. Khoza. Your final remarks, Sir Mr. Dlamini.
Thank you, Chris. I think at the end of the day, your name is everything. As an individual and as a professional and as a leader and as an employee and as a board member. And it's all that you have. You work for so long for it, but you can destroy it in a matter of minutes by failing to adhere to your value system. And when your moral judgment lapses, that's it for you. And it is very, very, very important that we do not look at organizational values as values actually that are divorced from our own personal values. The alignment and the congruency between your personal value as a leader and as a person and the organizational value have got to be 100% in congruence, because when they're not in tandem, you have a conflict that is then not easy to manage. For me, I cannot be part of an institution whose values I cannot actually relate to, because then it says there is a disconnect and there's going to be a void. Then it's a massive problem for me. So at the end of the day, let us do what we can be able actually, what makes us to go to bed at night and sleep soundly. But as a country, we have to work on the rule of law. Absolutely critical. But then the politicians have also played their part to make sure that the country is put on a path that is going to be prosperous and inclusive, and that is going to also have justice and equity in it. I thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Dlamini, Dr. Khoza. It's been a real privilege to engage with you, and I hand over to Prof. Rossouw. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for guiding us so ably through this conversation. You really succeeded in taking us into the intricacies of state-owned enterprises. And I think there are a number of messages from our panel that really resonates. And that is, amongst others, the comment by Dr. Khoza who said, it dare not be too late. And Mr. Dlamini who said, what we really need now is courageous leadership. And I think if we put these two things together, these two insights together, then I think we all agree that we need to restore urgently a sense of purpose in our state-owned enterprises. But then also to ensure that we also lead these enterprises with integrity and with competence. I would like to close off our meeting this morning after we started off in very choppy waters, initially as a result of the technical glitches that we experienced. Very glad that we had plain sailing after that. And I would like to just announce our latest publication in our Ethics Handbook series, the Ethical Culture Handbook. Please go to the website of the Ethics Institute, tei.org.za, and you can download a free copy of that, also of the other 9 titles in that Ethics Handbook series, and also other knowledge resources. I would like to finish by, first of all, thanking all our attendees for being here this morning, but more so for participating so actively. It was a joy to see all the informal chat going on in the chat function. Thank you also for all the questions that were raised. Then to our speakers, all of them who contributed to enrich this conversation about ethical leadership in our state-owned enterprises. Siemens for sponsoring our event, once again, much appreciated there. And then also to all my colleagues at the Ethics Institute who made all of this possible. Thank you, colleagues, for another great team effort and work to be proud of. So with that, thank you for attending, and I wish all of you a very good day. Thank you and goodbye.